We've got a very full agenda today. We've got a work session followed by 3 public hearings. So we're going to try to move along as well as we can, try to get as much in as we can. I can tell you now that we probably won't get all testifiers, probably won't be able to testify because we just don't have enough time in the whole meeting as a whole. So with that, I'd like to start the work session on establishing the Domestic Violence Extremism Commission. We've got some folks coming up here. If they would come, we've got Emily Kaufman and Joyce Bruce and Sahar Fathi coming up. They will. Ms. Kaufman is she is the Director of Investigative Research, Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism. And Fathi and Ms. Bruce are from the Attorney General's Office, the Director, Policy Director and Legislative Director. So, and then we'll have a couple of that, and we'll wrap this up in about a half an hour. So, if we're ready to start, Ms. Kaufman, are you ready?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me to talk about this. And I know we're to keep it to 10 minutes. I will go ahead and get us started. Oops. Oops. There we go. Perfect. So just very briefly, just who we are at the Center on Extremism. We are a clearinghouse of real-time information on extremism of all types. And so our staff regularly serve as expert witnesses, provide congressional testimony, and provide expertise to law enforcement, to tech companies, and to other constituents on the extremist landscape in the U.S. And I wanted to start today by talking about the history of white supremacy in Washington and in the Pacific Northwest. There is a significant history of white supremacy here, going all the way back to the KKK's involvement in the state, where up to 70,000 people participated in public rallies with the KKK in the 20s, through the violence perpetrated by white supremacist groups, including members of the racist skinhead movement as part of Volksfront, including a massive spree of criminal activity. We've seen the brutal murders of racially motivated murders in Portland in the 1980s. We've also, And this pattern has continued today, right? This is meant to show us that white supremacy has a deep history in Washington state, starting from the KKK, but moving to the formation of groups like the Aryan Nations, which were active just 30 miles northeast of Spokane, where that was the home base for their activity. And these white supremacist, racist skinhead groups, again, that were active in the 70s and 80s, and bringing us into the early 2000s with groups like Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi accelerationist group that had many arrests and significant criminal activity here in Washington state. So this is what sets us up for looking at the activity of white supremacist groups in Washington today. We can see from the images on your screen here that some of this activity has taken place very recently, just as recently as last weekend in Seattle. The images on the left side of your screen there show members of the White Lives Matter movement participating in a banner drop over the I-5 in Seattle. But what's concerning to us now is looking about 5 years after the Charlottesville trial, where we saw white supremacists come together in full force in Charlottesville, Virginia. We are starting to see again the collaboration between these white supremacist groups. And this is something we're seeing across the country, but especially here in Washington state, where we have groups like the white supremacist network of White Lives Matter, participating in activity alongside members of the Puget Sound Active Club, which is a white supremacist fight club, along with these smaller organizations that we've seen pop up, such as the Rose City Nationalists, which you see on the right side of your screen there. This organization just started their activity in August of 2022 and has already participated in 5 on-the-ground events, including in collaboration with members of these other groups. So we're concerned about this, right, because when these white supremacist groups, although they might be small, when they collaborate, they are able to get more people on the ground and to spread their hateful messages more effectively. White supremacist propaganda continues to be a serious, one of the major ways that these white supremacist groups get their ideology out, and it is a way for a small group of people to have an outsized impact. And it's also a way to terrorize communities, right, by sharing these really heinous messages with limited risk to the members of the groups themselves, limited risk for arrests and things like that. And in terms of that type of activity that we see in Washington, White Lives Matter, that group, they are prolific propagandists, but Patriot Front, as is the case throughout most of the United States, put out the most white supremacist propaganda in Washington state. And you can see from the map on the bottom right of your screen, this was released during leaks of Patriot Front chat information, and we can see that there is a concentrated effort to disseminate propaganda here in Washington state. And Patriot Front actually has a propaganda quota, which drives the high numbers of white supremacist propaganda that we see. And on top of that image, you can see where Patriot Front is defacing murals. This is an example from Olympia, Washington. And another thing that this group does that is important to note is that they intentionally use innocuous images, like the kind of like Reclaim America image that you see on your screen there. And the purpose of this, right, is to just lure people in, and then they share information about their white supremacist ideology once people are interested and have seen, what can be a fairly innocuous-looking sign or symbol, but they're brought in this manner. When we actually look at the number of white supremacist propaganda incidents in the United States, we are still seeing record numbers of this, but we did see a slight dip between 2020 and 2021. But this continues to be a strategy for white supremacist groups to maximize their influence. When we talk about the audit of anti-Semitic incidents, this also is including incidents of white supremacist propaganda that are anti-Semitic in nature. But we are in the midst of a trend of a 5-year increase in anti-Semitic incidents. And when we look at Washington state, we can see that there are very high numbers of anti-Semitic incidents in Washington state. We saw an increase of 34% in our reported anti-Semitic incidents between 2020 and 2021, and a 167% increase in anti-Semitic assaults. And when we're talking about white supremacist propaganda, the other thing to note here is that of the anti-Semitic incidents recorded by the ADL, 18% of those were perpetrated by known extremist groups, and a lot of this is largely being driven by the dissemination of white supremacist propaganda, where we've seen a 27% increase in anti-Semitic messaging attached to such propaganda. And I just wanted to really briefly note that you can see all of these incidents in as close to real time as possible on our heat map, which records incidents of hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism, including incidents of white supremacist propaganda down to the neighborhood level in Washington state. Now moving to some of the broader trends that we're seeing, we are seeing more and more that these narratives are motivating both extremists and non-extremists to action. Right, so when we think about something like the insurrection, we know that of the participants in the insurrection, about 23% of those were card-carrying members of extremist groups, right? But the rest of the folks who were participating were motivated by this big lie, right? By this election fraud narrative, and these bigger narratives and conspiracies are motivating extremist groups to action as they try to glom on and have a common cause with more mainstream actors, because they think if we show up to protest around these narratives, we can potentially recruit more people, we can get our message out, and we can say, hey, if you're sympathetic to the idea that these narratives are being elevated about, perhaps you might be sympathetic to our other ideas, right? I also just wanted to briefly note that we've seen an increased targeting of the LGBTQ plus community. Our partners at GLAD have noted that there have been at least 141 incidents of on-the-ground activity targeting members of the LGBTQ plus community in 2022. And we know that a lot of that activity, in fact, 50% in the last 3 months of 2022 were perpetrated by the Proud Boys. But extremists across the spectrum are being motivated by this, and we're seeing this in Washington State as well. Just recently in Renton, for example, there was a call to protest a drag event hosted at a local venue, and shots were fired at that venue. We're still unclear on the motive or who did that, but these venues are being targeted, and this is something that we are continuing to see. And lastly, I wanted to end today with something that is unique to Washington and to the Pacific Northwest on these well-connected extremist networks that we have. So we have the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, and the Washington State 3%ers are 3 distinct groups that elsewhere in the United States we don't necessarily see this kind of intense collaboration amongst groups, but we see that in the Pacific Northwest with everything from fundraising. So for example, members of these groups were able to raise $85,000 in bail funds for a member of the Proud Boys who was accused of assault. So these groups are able to effectively work together to raise funds and to increase participation at their activities. So this is a concerning trend we see in Washington State. And I think I'm out of time there. I wasn't sure if the lights flashing indicated that, so I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, when we talk about violent extremism, we talk about it from many different angles. You focused on one part of that, but just say there is a much bigger picture that we're looking at.
Yes,
correct?
absolutely.
Right.
These are looking at violent right-wing extremist groups and white supremacists and that kind of activity in Washington State specifically, yes.
Thank you. And then, quick, we do it when we get the other ones good? Yeah. And then we have a panel here. Thank you very much from the Attorney General's office. You prepared a report last year and gave us some direction on how to deal with this. So we want you to definitely share what you found and what you're recommending from looking at violent extremism in our society and how that plays out. Thank you for your work over the last year or so, and thank you for being here.
Well, Representative Chair, Chair Ramos, thank you so much for having us, members of the committee. My name is Sahar Fathi, and I'm joined by our Legislative Director, Joyce Bruce. We are just going to chat a little bit about the study that we conducted last year and what we found. And for folks who may not know all of the background, we were directed last year by the legislature to conduct a study by the end of the year that reviewed federal, state, local laws related to acts of domestic terrorism, as well as state and local data collection, any local policies, any state policies, and then summarizing all of those laws and identifying any best practices or making any recommendations. We decided to convene, because it was a 6-month period, we decided to convene 4 expert consultants across the country. We started with the Rapin Group. They are a public policy consulting firm. They were tasked with reviewing the local laws related to the acts of domestic terrorism. We had Rich Stoltz, who is the former executive director of One America. He was in charge of doing our outreach on the ground and our community engagement. And then we had 2 experts in DC, Cynthia Miller-Idris, who is a professor at American University and the director of the Polarization and Extremism Research Lab. And we had ICAP, which is the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and that was Mary McCord. And I'm gonna start a little bit with what we found in outreach, because outreach really sort of determined how we got to our recommendations. When we started out our outreach, we started with the idea of domestic terrorism and the term domestic terrorism, and there was a lot more support for greater attention to the issue of domestic violent extremism, and I'll go in the next slide about the difference between the two. Participants felt that there was significant level of fear over the potential use of violence against their communities. There was significant concern, however, about using the term domestic terrorism because of how BIPOC communities have been treated in the past with that term in our country. There was ambivalence over the need for additional law enforcement tools, and that is something that we took in deep consideration as we went through the report. So the sort of big thing that we shifted here was, instead of using the term domestic terrorism, which felt very triggering for a lot of these communities, we decided to use the term domestic violent extremism. It is a term that is consistent with what the FBI is currently using. Domestic terrorism is undefined in Washington state. It's defined in federal law, but it fails to sort of capture the full scope of the problem, which includes other forms of extremist and political violence, threats, coercion, intimidation, online disinformation, extremist recruitment, government infiltration, and the general spread of extreme white supremacist, anti-government, and other ideologies. It also recommends in this report that the commission and I'll walk through the commission momentarily, that it refrain from proposing new criminal laws defining and penalizing the term domestic terrorism, that really we focus on using domestic violent extremism instead. And that was in light of both the evidence-based community concern that these types of laws had the potential to be applied disproportionately against BIPOC communities, but also the feedback that we heard directly from those communities when we spoke with them. And then lastly, just the idea that even if the commission does consider new DVE-related criminal penalties, that they are very narrowly crafted to avoid any possibility of disproportionate application to any kind of vulnerable or marginalized community. I think sort of out the gate, we want to make sure that we start with sort of addressing that this report really thought about using a public health approach, and that's very innovative in the state of Washington, but also innovative across the country. And when we say a public health approach, we mean sort of addressing all of domestic violent extremism from what is rooted in community need, the holistic perspective of it, relying on evidence-based intervention, and focusing on building resilient systems. And recently, the report was called a model for other states on PBS NewsHour because Washington state would be the first in the nation to adopt and implement a public health style and community-based framework for proactively responding to DVE if that approach were taken. We had a number of recommendations. The most significant one was to create a 2-year commission with the broad goal of establishing this public health and community-based framework. There were a number of recommendations that I'll get into as well. The second recommendation, and you'll see that these are sort of spread apart. We had recommendations that went through 2 rounds of outreach and engagement, and that's what we call recommendations with stakeholder input. We had some additional recommendations that over the course of the study came to us, but did not get to go through the full 2 rounds of outreach, and we separate those out at the end, just to make sure that folks know that we didn't get to do that. The second recommendation is to rely on this expert research and data and propose specific steps to adopt and fund a public health style community-based framework for proactively responding to DVE. The third is to rely on expert research and data and propose specific steps to improve, standardize, and add transparency to data collection and reporting on incidents of DVE. And then the fourth is to create what we call sort of a toolkit of potential legal options and explore new legislation and regulations. Some of the sub-recommendations that we came across and that we vetted with these stakeholders included establishing a system through which the Department of Health could work with community groups to support multidisciplinary intervention teams, a plan to develop a statewide training module to help employees recognize red flags and warning signs, initial pathways for intervention conversations, where to get additional help, funding the creation of civic education and community support hubs to invest in civic education to combat misinformation and disinformation, and then funding for primary prevention of DVE through the arts, community organizations, and faith communities. So really thinking holistically about how to prevent these incidents from happening. The second round of recommendations that we sort of started to receive partway through the outreach, we had 3 additional recommendations that we brought from the AG. And one is to create a journalism fellowship program. We believe at the Attorney General's office that in order to combat misinformation and disinformation, the local journalism really does play an important part. And so this fellowship program would be based off of a program that was created in California that funded a number of fellowships with local journalism media outlets for strengthening that reporting. The second is to protect election workers at all costs. So that in this particular recommendation, calling out the harassment of an election official as a Class C felony and making sure that personal addresses of these election officials, which would include both temporary and part-time employees, for their personal addresses to be removed from public databases. And the last recommendation was to provide additional security funding for elected officials. And that is the end of the report. Bill Green.
Great. Well, thank you very much. With that, we had a couple presentations here. I'd like to see if we have any questions for the panel. Ranking member.
Lost my little thing here. Emily, thank you for the presentation. I just want to start off with saying, anytime a group, uses immutable characteristics to abuse or intimidate another group is just wrong. I mean, it's absolutely wrong, no matter, color, creed, race, religion. I mean, you shouldn't think that you're better than someone else just because of immutable characteristics. But what I'd like to know a little bit more about, and it's what the chair pointed out, ADL does research for a lot of different extremisms. Can you talk a little bit more? I mean, most certainly point taken on the white supremacy point, but can we talk a little bit more about, CHOP and CHAZ and Antifa, abuse of Asian Americans and the targeting of seniors who are protected classes and the rise of those, which don't always seem to be necessarily race-based, but ageist or something like that, and talk a little bit more about your research in that realm as well. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we do cover extremism across the ideological spectrum. The presentation today focused generally on white supremacy and right-wing extremism, and why that is because our data shows that these are the areas that most ardently need addressing. So, for example, when we look at our murder and extremism reports, if we look at violence committed by extremist groups of all types, right? Looking at the past 20 years, we know that the vast majority of those murders have been committed by right-wing extremists, and the majority of those are white supremacists. There is one Antifa-related murder that we are aware of, and that took place in 2020 in Portland, Oregon, in a confrontation between a member of the right-wing extremist group Patriot Prayer and an Antifa adherent. So that is why the presentation focused more on those groups. But of course, we are always concerned when there are militant factions of the broad Antifa movement, right, that are willing to engage in violence to support their ideology. That is something that is of course concerning to us. Where we see most of the violence in those cases are in clashes between other groups, right? So if we can think back to 2017 and 2018 and all of the protest activity that we saw in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the violence that took place were in clashes between groups where it's often unclear who exactly instigates the violence, but that is our kind of primary, the primary spot where we see those issues emerge. And we are absolutely concerned about the rise in AAPI hate. I think that's, as you astutely pointed out, and that was not part of the presentation today, but it is absolutely something that we're looking into. And at ADL, we are also we bring on folks from partnering organizations who can embed with us and provide information on groups that we haven't typically covered. So we've recently brought on an anti-LGBTQ+ extremism analyst and are looking for embedded folks for a variety of other issue areas as well. Happy to clarify further if there's any other questions.
Cool. Thank you very much. Representative Lowe, you have a question.
So the Attorney General's office was given $125,000 to do this study and report. Is that report in the materials provided to us?
Excuse me, could you clarify the question?
Report, the study.
Apologies. Are you asking if there is information in the report related to how the funds were allocated?
So there's $125,000 allocated last year.
Sure.
And it was to study and produce a report. So we had a slide presentation today. Is that the report, or is there a
Yes.
bigger actual report?
That is the report, and I'm happy to follow up with the committee after this work session and share that report with the committee.
So there's a different report than what was submitted today?
The PowerPoint slides were just a summary of the report findings. There is a report. I'm holding a copy of it. I'm happy to share it with you after.
Great, thank you. That's what I wanted.
We'll get that sent to every committee member. All right. Vice Chair, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. I was just sort of curious if you could elaborate on the demographics maybe of the people who are recruited to these organizations. Are they young, single, married, rich, poor, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and of course, it does depend a little bit on the group you're talking about. So, for example, we have a report out on so the Oath Keepers, right? The Oath Keepers intentionally recruit members of law enforcement and former military members into their ranks, and with a leak of information from their rosters, ADL was able to find 14,000 individuals who were associated with the Oath Keepers that also held either law enforcement or public office positions. So that is deeply concerning. That, right, this group's recruiting tactic is actually to target those groups. But when we're looking more broadly, it's really in this day and age with the technology and how folks are accessing this information, it does tend to be people who are like a bit on the younger side. But a concern is that when you have folks who are engaged around some of those narratives that I talked about, who might be entering a group on Telegram, for example, which is an encrypted social media messaging platform around, anti-vaccine, rhetoric or something like that, that they can be very quickly exposed to more and more extreme content because these other extremist groups are able to operate with impunity in some of these unmoderated spaces. So right now, our concern about recruitment is really based on how quickly and easily folks are able to be exposed to more and more extreme information within these online spaces, especially where they're flocking to these unmoderated spots where this information can flow freely.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for producing that report. Thank you for your research and data that you collect and presenting it today. So in touch, and thank you very much. All right?
Thank you.